October 1967, Nickajack Cave, Tennessee. Johnny Cash crawled 3 miles into absolute darkness with one simple intention: never coming back out. His pockets bulged with amphetamine pills he didn't plan to take. Not anymore. His flashlight battery was dying. His mind was dying faster. And in the suffocating blackness of that limestone tomb, surrounded by silence so complete it felt like being buried alive, something happened that Johnny Cash would spend the rest of his life trying to explain. What he saw or felt or heard or experienced in ways language couldn't capture, in those final moments before his light went out forever, would either kill him or save him. There was no middle ground, and what emerged from that cave 3 hours later wasn't the same man who went in. Before we descend into the darkness with him, tell me, what city are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments, because this story about hitting rock bottom is universal, and I want to know where you're hearing it from. Here's the question that'll wreck you. If you were drowning in your own choices, completely alone in the dark with no way out, would you have the strength to save yourself? Or would you let the darkness win? Johnny Cash faced that exact choice in a cave so deep that sunlight was just a myth. If this story shakes you the way it should, hit that subscribe button. We're about to explore the most terrifying night in country music history. The road to Nickajack Cave began years before Johnny Cash ever set foot near its entrance, back when success tasted like poison and fame felt like a prison sentence he'd volunteered for. By 1967, he was arguably the biggest star in country music, sold-out shows, chart-topping records, a household name that even people who hated country music recognized. But success hadn't filled the void inside him. If anything, it had made the emptiness more obvious, more impossible to ignore. The amphetamines he'd started taking to keep up with his brutal touring schedule had evolved from performance enhancement to survival mechanism to suicide in slow motion. He was consuming hundreds of pills weekly, sometimes daily, his body a chemical factory producing nothing but anxiety and paranoia. The man who sang about walking the line couldn't even walk straight anymore, stumbling through life like a ghost haunting his own existence. His first marriage to Vivian Liberto was disintegrating in real time, destroyed by his infidelity, his addiction, and his complete inability to be present even when he was physically home. Their 4 daughters watched their father transform from the man who used to sing them to sleep into someone they barely recognized, thin to the point of skeletal, paranoid, violent in unpredictable bursts. The divorce proceedings had started, and Johnny knew he was losing his family. But the knowledge didn't change his behavior, because the addiction had long since stopped being about choice. Every person who loved him was either leaving or preparing to leave, and some dark part of him believed he deserved the abandonment. June Carter was the only constant, the only person who refused to give up on him even when giving up would have been the rational choice. She had watched him deteriorate for years, had tried intervention after intervention, had prayed and pleaded and threatened. But by October 1967, even June's faith was wavering. She had told him point blank, "Get clean or lose me too." It wasn't an ultimatum born from cruelty but from survival. She could feel herself being pulled into his spiral. Johnny had promised to get help. He'd promised 1,000 times before. Words had become meaningless, just sounds he made to buy time before the next handful of pills. But this time, something in June's eyes told him she actually meant it, that this was the final offer before she walked away forever. The weight of losing everyone, his daughters, his wife, June, his career, his reputation, should have motivated change. Instead, it accelerated the death spiral because Johnny had reached a point where the prospect of recovery felt more terrifying than the certainty of destruction. Recovery meant facing everything he'd done, everyone he'd hurt, every promise he'd broken. Recovery meant looking in a mirror and accepting responsibility. Destruction, on the other hand, had a sick appeal. If he could just finish the job, if he could just push through to the end, then at least the guilt would stop. At least the shame would end. That's the logic of advanced addiction, when dying starts to feel like relief instead of tragedy. The Nickajack Cave entrance sat near the Tennessee-Alabama border, a massive opening in limestone cliffs that led to one of the most extensive cave systems in the region. Local teenagers used the outer chambers for parties. Historians knew it as a Creek Indian shelter, but Johnny Cash knew it as something else entirely, a place where people disappeared. The cave system extended for miles in multiple directions, a three-dimensional maze of passages and chambers where getting lost was easy and getting found was nearly impossible. Perfect. He had driven there on October 25, 1967, alone in his Jeep, telling nobody where he was going because nobody needed to know. This wasn't a cry for help. This was the opposite, a deliberate move toward silence. What he planned to do in that cave, he had never explicitly stated, but his intentions were written in every action that followed. He parked the Jeep in a clearing near the entrance and sat there for almost an hour, engine off, staring at the cave mouth like it was a doorway to another dimension. Maybe it was. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the amphetamines still coursing through his system, his body's chemistry so corrupted that normal didn't exist anymore. He had pills with him, enough to keep the withdrawal at bay for days if he wanted. But he didn't want days. He wanted finality. The plan, to the extent there was one, was simple. Walk into the cave until the flashlight died, then keep walking in the darkness until he couldn't walk anymore, until exhaustion or injury or simple despair stopped him permanently. Let the cave have him. At some point, sitting in that Jeep, Johnny Cash made peace with dying, or thought he did. The first 100 yards into Nickajack Cave were deceptively easy. The passage wide enough to walk upright, the floor relatively smooth from decades of foot traffic. Sunlight penetrated this far, creating a gradient from day to dusk that felt almost peaceful. But he knew the geography changed rapidly once you moved past the twilight zone. At 200 yards, the main passage split into 3 branches, and Johnny took the middle path without hesitation, as if it didn't matter which route led to oblivion. The ceiling lowered here, forcing him to stoop, and the walls closed in until he could touch both sides by extending his arms. The limestone was wet, slick with condensation that made every surface treacherous. His boots slipped periodically, and he had to catch himself against the walls, his hands coming away coated in cave mud that smelled like minerals and thyme. The silence was the first thing that truly registered as wrong, as fundamentally different from any silence he'd experienced above ground. In the world outside, silence is relative. There's always wind, always distant traffic, always something. But cave silence is absolute, the kind of quiet that makes you hear your own heartbeat, your own breathing, the blood moving through your veins. It's the silence of being buried alive. Johnny stopped walking and stood completely still, just listening to the nothing, and felt something close to peace for the first time in years. If death sounded like this, like perfect, complete absence, then maybe it wouldn't be so bad. But then his flashlight flickered, and the peace evaporated into something much closer to terror. The battery was dying faster than he'd anticipated, the beam weakening from bright white to sickly yellow. He had maybe 30 minutes of light left, probably less. Basic survival instinct kicked in, the same instinct that had kept him alive through car crashes and overdoses. Turn back. Go now while you can still see. But Johnny shoved that instinct down, buried it beneath the weight of everything he'd done wrong, everyone he'd failed. No. Keep going. Finish this. He moved deeper into the cave, the passage narrowing further until he was crawling on hands and knees through sections barely wider than his body. The rock scraped his back, his shoulders drawing blood he couldn't see, but could feel warm and wet through his shirt. Physical pain was almost welcome. It was concrete, immediate, different from the psychological agony that had no form. At what he guessed was 2 miles in, Johnny reached a chamber large enough to stand in. The flashlight, now barely brighter than a candle, revealed a space about 15 feet across with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness. Water dripped somewhere in the black above, each drop echoing like a countdown. This felt like a good place to stop, a good place to end. He sat down on the wet rock floor, his back against the cave wall, and turned off the flashlight to conserve the dying battery for what? For nothing. So he turned it back on and watched the beam get weaker in real time, fading from yellow to orange like a sunset in reverse. When it finally died, the darkness that swallowed him was so complete, it felt like a physical substance, like he'd gone blind, or cease to exist entirely. Total darkness does strange things to the human mind. Within minutes, Johnny began seeing things that couldn't possibly be there. Phosphorescent patterns dancing across his vision, geometric shapes that existed only in his brain trying to process zero input. His sense of up and down became uncertain. The dripping water sounded like voices, then like music, then like nothing he could describe. Time lost all meaning. Had he been sitting there for 10 minutes or 3 hours? Impossible to tell. His amphetamine-ravaged nervous system created sensations of movement when he was sitting perfectly still, convinced him that insects were crawling on his skin when nothing touched him. Paranoia bloomed into full panic as his mind populated the darkness with threats. But beneath the panic was something else, the absolute certainty that he deserved whatever happened next. Johnny Cash had never been particularly religious in the formal sense, despite growing up in a household where faith was woven into daily life. His mother had prayed constantly, had believed with absolute conviction that God watched over her family even when poverty and hardship suggested otherwise. Johnny had gone to church, had memorized scripture, had even felt genuine moments of connection to something larger than himself. But addiction had severed that connection, replaced faith with emptiness, replaced God with amphetamines. Now, sitting in darkness so complete it erased the boundary between thought and reality, Johnny found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. He tried to pray. The words came out broken, barely whispered into the void. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything. I can't do this anymore." But something was happening in that darkness, something his conscious mind struggled to categorize or explain. It started as a sensation, not a voice exactly, but a presence, as if the cave itself had become aware of him, as if he wasn't alone anymore. The sensation grew stronger, more insistent, and with it came something Johnny hadn't felt in so long, he'd almost forgotten the word for it. Judgment. Not harsh condemnation, but clear-eyed assessment, like being seen completely for the first time in his life. Every lie he'd told, every person he'd hurt, every promise he'd broken, all of it visible in the darkness. And in that moment of absolute exposure, Johnny Cash experienced something that would define the rest of his life. He understood that dying in this cave wasn't his decision to make. The realization didn't come gently. It crashed over him like a physical force, leaving him gasping and disoriented. Somewhere in his mind, or maybe outside it, he was never quite sure, a message formed with perfect clarity. "You're not supposed to be here. This is not your time. You have work to do." The words weren't audible, weren't spoken in any conventional sense, but they were absolutely real, more real than anything he'd experienced in years of chemical-induced hallucinations. Johnny tried to argue with the presence, tried to explain that he was too broken, too far gone, but the presence refused the argument with something like divine stubbornness. Find the way out. The instruction was clear and non-negotiable. Johnny's first response was to laugh, a sound that echoed strangely in the chamber and came back to him distorted. Find the way out. He was 3 miles deep in a cave system with no light, no map, no sense of direction. People died in caves like this all the time. What chance did a drug-addled country singer have? But even as the logical part of his mind catalogued the impossibility, his body was already moving, responding to the command like a soldier following orders. He stood on legs that had been motionless for hours, joints screaming in protest. The presence hadn't told him how to get out, only that he had to, and somehow, impossibly, that felt like enough. What followed was less a journey, and more a kind of spiritual navigation that Johnny would struggle to explain for the rest of his life. He moved through the darkness with his hands on the walls, feeling for passages, for air currents, for anything that might indicate direction. He should have been lost within minutes, should have wandered in circles until exhaustion claimed him. But something, intuition, divine guidance, pure, desperate luck, kept him moving in roughly the right direction. He crawled through passages he didn't remember crawling through on the way in. He navigated forks in the tunnel by choosing whichever direction felt right, felt like it led toward life instead of deeper into death. Hours passed, or minutes, or days, Time had lost all conventional meaning in the absolute darkness. His knees bled from crawling over sharp rock, his hands were shredded, but he kept moving because stopping meant accepting that the message had been wrong. At some point during the crawl, Johnny had what he would later describe as a vision. The darkness somehow became different, not lighter exactly, but less absolute. In this altered darkness, he saw his life laid out before him, not as memory, but as objective reality. The boy in Arkansas who had loved music and God and his family, the young man who had compromised those loves in pursuit of fame, the addict who had nearly killed everything good in his life. But he also saw something else that made him stop crawling and weep openly. He saw what his life could become if he chose differently, if he walked back into the light and fought for sobriety with the same determination he'd brought to this suicide mission. He saw himself clean, performing again, loving June openly, making peace with his daughters, not as fantasy, but as genuine possibility contingent on a single choice. The choice was brutally simple. Keep crawling toward the entrance or turn around and go back into the depths, life or death, hope or surrender. And in that moment, bleeding and exhausted and still fundamentally broken, Johnny Cash chose life. Not because living was easy, or because he'd suddenly become optimistic about his chances, but because the presence had told him his story wasn't finished, and some part of him, however small, believed it. He resumed crawling, moving faster now, driven by purpose. His hands found a passage that angled upward, and he followed it, scrambling over rocks that tore his clothes and skin. The air changed, became less stale. And then, after what felt like both an eternity and an instant, he saw it. The faintest grey glow ahead, dim as a dying star but unmistakable. The transition from total darkness to the cave entrance's dim light should have been gradual. But to Johnny's darkness-adapted eyes, it felt like staring into the sun. He had to stop 20 yards from the opening and let his vision adjust. His body was a catalogue of damage, bleeding hands and knees, bruised ribs, muscles cramped from hours of crawling, dehydrated to the point where his tongue felt like leather. But he was alive. Against all probability, against his own intentions, he was crawling toward daylight. When he finally emerged into October afternoon sunlight, Johnny Cash collapsed on the ground outside the cave entrance and just breathed, sucking in air that tasted like life and possibility. He lay there for almost an hour, unable to move, processing what had happened in ways that rational thought couldn't quite capture. He had entered that cave to die. That wasn't metaphor. He had genuinely intended to find a dark corner and let addiction, exhaustion, or the cave itself finish what he'd started years ago with his first handful of pills. But something in the darkness had refused his offering, had sent him back with instructions he didn't fully understand but couldn't ignore. When he finally gathered enough strength to stand and walk to his jeep, he noticed something shocking. His pockets were still full of amphetamine pills, hundreds of them. He pulled them out in handfuls, these little demons that had ruled his life for so long, and poured them on the ground outside the cave entrance. Every single pill, scattered on Tennessee dirt, left there like an offering to the darkness that had rejected him. The drive back to Nashville was long and silent, Johnny's mind oscillating between profound clarity and deep confusion about what had actually happened. Had God spoken to him? Had he hallucinated the entire experience due to drug withdrawal and sensory deprivation? Did the distinction even matter if the result was the same? He knew people would be skeptical, knew that claiming divine intervention in a cave sounded like exactly the kind of thing an addict would say. But he also knew with certainty that lived in his bones that something fundamental had shifted. The man driving this Jeep wasn't the same man who had driven it to the cave. That man had been ready to die. This man was ready to fight. The first person he called was June, and his opening words were, "I need help, real help, and I'm ready to accept it." June Carter's response was immediate and practical. She picked him up herself, took one look at his condition, and drove him directly to a hospital where doctors could monitor his withdrawal. The next weeks were brutal, a special kind of hell where Johnny's body rebelled against the absence of chemicals it had become dependent on. He shook violently. He hallucinated. He vomited until there was nothing left. But through it all, he held on to the memory of that voice in the darkness, that presence that had insisted his story wasn't finished. June stayed with him through the worst of it, sleeping in a chair beside his hospital bed, refusing to leave even when nurses suggested she go home and rest. Now he had something to match her faith with, a purpose born in absolute darkness that demanded he keep living. The recovery process wasn't linear or easy. Johnny relapsed multiple times in the months following the cave incident, each relapse feeling like a betrayal of the promise he'd made in the dark. But something was different now. He had a reference point, a moment when he'd been given a choice and chosen life. That moment became his anchor when cravings overwhelmed him. He would close his eyes and remember the complete darkness of Nickajack Cave, remember the presence that had sent him back, and find enough strength to say, "No one more time." It wasn't dramatic or inspirational in the way movies depict recovery. It was grinding, daily work of choosing sobriety over comfort. But he did the work, supported by June's relentless faith and motivated by the growing conviction that his life had been saved for specific reasons. The most immediate change was in his music. Within months of the cave incident, Johnny began writing and recording with a rawness that shocked even longtime fans. Songs like Folsom Prison Blues took on new meaning when performed by someone who had genuinely contemplated death and chosen life instead. His voice, damaged by years of abuse, but somehow more powerful for its imperfection, carried authority that polished studio perfection could never match. But Johnny wasn't performing for critics. He was fulfilling the mandate given to him in the darkness: do the work. And for him, the work was using music to tell truths that people needed to hear. The cave had taught him that vulnerability wasn't weakness. It was the most honest thing a person could offer. Johnny married June Carter on March 1, 1968, less than 5 months after crawling out of Nickajack Cave. When he said his vows to June, he wasn't just promising fidelity and partnership. He was acknowledging that she had saved his life as surely as whatever presence had spoken to him in the cave. Together they built a life that honored the second chance Johnny had been given, a life focused on faith, family, and using his platform to help people struggling with the same demons he'd faced. The cave had shown him that life was a gift, not an entitlement, and gifts demanded gratitude expressed through action. Johnny Cash never stopped talking about the Nickajack Cave experience for the next 35 years, until his death in 2003. He described the darkness, the despair, the presence, the crawl toward light, and he described it the same way every time, with the consistency of someone recounting objective truth rather than constructed myth. When pressed about whether he actually heard a voice or just felt a strong impression, he would shrug and say, "Does it matter? Something in that cave told me to live and I listened. That's the only part that counts." The distinction between supernatural intervention and psychological breakthrough seemed irrelevant to him. The outcome was identical either way. What he discovered in the pitch-black cave was both simple and profound. You are not the worst thing you've ever done. Your story isn't finished and you have work to do. That message became the foundation for everything he accomplished and remains his most important legacy.